just a second.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. This is our first webinar of the year. I'm Rafael Ribeiro, professor of economics at the Federal University of Minas Gerais and also the coordinator of the Keynesian Economics Working Group, right? And today we have as our special guests, Professor Enrico Sérgio Levreiro, who is Associate Professor of Monetary Economics at Roma III University. He has research interests in the theories of value and distribution, wages, and the labor market, monetary economics, and Zarafa revival of classical theory. And also Ricardo Pariboni is a research fellow and lecturer at Roma III University. His main research interests are growth theory, the relationship between income distribution and growth, and labor economics. So let's start now. Please, Professor Sérgio, you can start now, please.
Okay. Thank you, Rafael. And so the content of this presentation is on the Taylor rule, and in particular to discuss to what extent the Taylor rule may be considered an appropriate representation of central bank behaviors and to rationalize their tendency to react to price inflation by an increase in the interest rates when following a classical Keynesian approach. And it also aims to criticize those Taylor's rules interpretations that refer the benchmark rate of monetary policy to an equilibrium or natural real rate of interest independent from certain bank setting of the interest rate. This is a brief outline of the presentation. First, we will begin by saying something on the origin and use of the Taylor rule, stressing some difficulties in its implementation, especially when following its interpretation by the new consensus model. Then we pass to describe some limits of some alternative interpretation, and in particular those of Dumenil-Levy and Stockhammer. And finally, if we have time, we will say something about some first elements for an interpretation along classical lines of the Taylor rule when it is interpreted, as it is in actual fact, as a flexible and not mechanical benchmark of monetary policy, and these are seen to affect income distribution between wages and profits. Only advice to everybody is listening us, these are preliminary results in the sense that these are discussions within our group that work on monetary policy, and so probably there will be errors and something to be discussed among us. I do not speak now on the origin and use of the Taylor rule to a great extent because we have already spoken about it in previous seminar, where we have outlined how we find some preliminary rules very similar to the Taylor rule, also before the article of Taylor of 1993. In particular, for instance, if we look at the bottom of the slide to the rule of the Brookings Institution of 1992, we see that it is very similar to that of Taylor in the sense that it prescribed to change the rate of interest when there is a discrepancy between the actual inflation rate P and the target inflation rate P star, and between the actual output and the planned output Q star. If we look to the Taylor rule as he advanced it at 1993, Taylor put the natural rate of interest as equal to 2%. He calculated it as an average real interest rate, which is observable over a long time horizon. He put the target rate of inflation as equal to 2%, and he put the parameters of reaction of the central banks to discrepancies between the inflation rate and the target rate and between the out and to output gap, both equal to 0.5. In its original version, the Taylor rule only requires to know the current rate of inflation and the output gap. And it prescribes to change the rate of interest to lean against the wind in the presence of demand shocks, and a balanced approach in the case of supply shocks. It also embodies what will be called the Taylor principle, namely an increase in the nominal rate of interest more than the increase in inflation rate. In fact, it may be rewritten as E equal to 1.5 multiplied by the inflation rate plus 0.5 multiplied by the output gap plus 1. And so if you have an increase of the inflation rate of 1%, you will increase the interest rate more than 1%. So the first point to be ascertained is whether the Taylor rule is a good representation of the behavior of central banks, and what would be the consequences of a deviation from it. And to assess this point, Taylor compares the actual course of the federal fund rate, viewed as the rate settled by the Federal Reserve, with the rate of interest which would be prescribed by his rule according to two possible values of the parameter theta p, namely theta p equal to 0.5 and theta p equal to 1. He then compares the estimated values of these parameters as stemming from the estimates of the equation E equal A plus theta epsilon multiplied by the output gap plus theta p multiplied by the inflation rate, where A is the intercept of the line with the vertical axis. And he does so in order to assess if the actual reaction parameters of the Federal Reserve have followed or have failed to follow the Taylor principle, namely a percentage increase of the nominal rate of interest greater than that of the rate of inflation. On the basis of this comparison, Taylor concludes that the monetary policy was too accommodative in the 70s when you see a too low reaction to inflation. It was restrictive in the 80s when the reaction to the output gap was too low, and indeed it performs good only in the period of the great moderation between 1987 and 1995. With respect to the period 1979, Taylor ascribed the failure of his law to the slope of the estimated equation of the rule, which is lower than that required to maintain or bring back the real rate of interest to its equilibrium level. If you see the line which is below that starting from 2%, the fact that its slope is lower means that you are not following the Taylor principle. Now, the fact that the original Taylor rule doesn't work well in various periods, such as the 1960s and the 1970s, or also during the 2000s, is widely recognized in the literature. And what we want now to try to stress is how in the literature there is a tentative to try to estimate a different version of the Taylor rule, and the debate on the stance of monetary policies that we find in consequence of this tentative. This is a relevant point because you must discuss if the failure of the Taylor rule to describe the course of monetary policy depends from other factors that may influence the decision of monetary authorities other than the rate of inflation and the output gap, or instead there are some versions and of the Taylor rule that can understand well the course of monetary policy. So in the literature, it has been emphasized that the output gap is unknown and must be estimated, that the natural rate of interest may change over time, that central banks tend to smooth the changes in the rate of interest due to the uncertainty on the true values of those unobservable variables, that the structure of the economy and the lacks in the effects of monetary policies. It has also been outlined that the results are sensible to the weights ascribed in the rule to central banks' reaction to price inflation and changes in the output gap, and that the results are sensible to the measures of price inflation and the output gap which are chosen. So, in the literature, we have a great variety of Taylor rules. The first two, those advanced by Taylor himself, one in the 1993 and the second in the 1999, where in the second he changed the weights given to output gap in fixing the rate of interest. You have, for instance, an inertial rule where the rate of interest depends also from the past values of the rate of interest. You have a rule where there is a variable natural rate of interest that must be estimated. And then you have a lot of versions of the Taylor rule that are a forward-looking rules where the rate of interest depends from the expected inflation rate. There is also a version of the Taylor rule where the output gap must not be estimated, and also it is not present the natural rate of interest. And in this sense, this kind of rule does not present some problem that now we will try to outline with respect to the other version of the Taylor rule. Now, as said before, these different rules have been used to call into question the idea that central banks fail to follow the prescription of the Taylor rule. So, for instance, Bernanke, in response to Taylor's criticism to the conduct of the monetary policies by the Federal Reserve, stated that, contrary to what's shown by the original Taylor rule, a modified rule in which inflation is measured by the core consumer price index rather than by the GDP deflator, and there is a balanced approach assigned to the Federal Reserve with a weight equal to 1 on output gap, would indicate that the Federal fund rates has followed the rates prescribed by the Taylor rule before reaching the zero lower bound in 2009. So you can compare the two graphs and you see the result of the estimates. If you follow one on other the assumption about the measure of price inflation and the parameter that estimates the reaction of the central bank to output gap, to the output gap. The risk arises, however, that in this way, namely changing the equation to estimate the Taylor rule, you will only adjust the value of the parameters and of the unobservable variables, that is, of the natural rate of interest and the potential output, in order to fit better the data, thus losing any prescriptive role for the Taylor rule. This is the case, for instance, of the estimation of Koenig, where if you look to the graph, the interest rate prescribed by his rule follow the changes of the federal funds rate very precisely. As stressed by Rudebusch, there is also the risk that the weight given to interest rate smoothing will hidden other economic factors influencing monetary policy, which are not considered in the equation of the Taylor rule. But more important, there is a problem stressed by Yellen, namely that a wide variety of the presence of a wide variety of simple rules give to left monetary policy with the difficulty to not know what exactly to do, because any of these rules may have very different policy implication according to the different specification of the rule. In discussing the Taylor rule, there is a crucial point that regard the natural rate of interest that is behind, as now we will clarify, is behind the Taylor rule. And these problems are both statistical problems, the problems to estimate a counterfactual variable as the natural rate of interest, and also theoretical problems. As you know, the usual interpretation of the Taylor rule has been, for instance, clarified by Greenspan in his 1993 Humphrey Hawkins testimony to the Congress. The stance of monetary policy should be judged by comparing actual interest rate with an equilibrium interest rate. Now I'm quoting Greenspan, specifically the real rate level that, if maintained, would keep the economy at its production potential over time. And according to the prevailing literature, this natural rate is affected solely by real factors such as productivity growth, the growth of the workforce, the time preference of households, and the movements in government expenditure, mirroring over time the dynamics of these driving forces. As you know, the base of this interpretation is in the new Keynesian models, in which the LM curve is substituted by the Taylor rule on the belief that changes in the price level don't stem from changes in the money supply, but from exogenous shocks that led to discrepancy between the natural rate of interest and the interest rate settled by the central bank. And so, in order to stabilize price and output, monetary policy authorities should credibly commit themselves to following the natural rate of interest and reacting to unfavorable situations. Of course, in this case, the benchmark rate, that is the natural rate of interest, should be readily computable from observable economic data, but its counterfactual nature leads to a variety of estimate methods and results that recall the early criticism by Myrdal and Lindahl that Wicksel's natural rate is not an operational notion, in the sense that it is incapable of practical application. These different estimates methods are also associated to different notions of the natural rate of interest, according to the hypotheses which are done on the degree of imperfections in the labor market and the commodities market and the effects of shocks on the natural rate of interest. To give an example, we can consider a permanent shift of the ES curve from ES1 to ES2. If the monetary authorities don't change the interest rate, output will fall to Y1 below potential level YP. If at this point a temporary shift of the ES curve on the left occurs due to an increase in the propensity to save and a decrease of firm willingness to invest during the crisis, the settlement of the rate of interest to the new normal rate, EN2, will not assure output that comes back to its potential level. The benchmark of the monetary authorities should indeed be the, now I am using Robertson word, a quasi-natural rates of interest, IQN1 and IOIQN2, according to the shift, the temporary shift of the ES curve, due precisely to temporary shocks. What I have shown with this simple example with the shifts in the ES curve is exactly what we find in the literature on the estimates of the natural rate of interest. Those, for instance, who, like Taylor and Weiland, refer to a long-run notion of the natural rate of interest that, according to them, would be in the US around 2.53%, tended to criticize Fed monetary policies after 2010 for being too expansionary, a thesis that Bernanke refuted due to the absence of accelerating inflation. On the contrary, those who referred to a quasi-natural rate of interest and deemed that it fell sharply during the crisis due to low expected productivity and the rising propensity to save, evaluated the stance of monetary policy as still not expansionary, even when bringing the policy rates towards zero. And so you find there the examples of two, but you don't see that, and I don't know how to do. Okay, and so you can see two kinds of estimates. The line blue referred to Kurdia estimates, and they are done using structural method when you have, in a sense, shifts of the ES curve due to transitory shocks. And the other one are the estimates done by Laubach and Williams with their semi-structural method, where these temporary shocks are influence less the result of the estimates. Of course, according to the kind of estimates that you think are the better estimates of the natural rate of interest, you can have very important consequences for the implementation of monetary policies. If, as in the case of the Kurdia estimates, you think that after 2007, the natural think that the monetary policy, also if the rate of interest is brought to zero, is not expansive. If you don't think so, so if you think that the natural rate of interest remain positive, you have, of course, another judgment of the monetary policies conducted by the Federal Reserve and also by the other central banks. Of course, this is a criticism to the Taylor rule, which refer to the problem of estimates of the parameters of the rule. But there is, of course, also a theoretical criticism that we can advance against the Taylor rule. And we can start by considering the structure of the model of the new of the so-called new consensus model, as you know, the four main equations of the model are given by a Phillips curve, an ES curve, a Fisher equation, and the loss function for the central bank. And from this equation, you can derive the Taylor rule. Now, it is implicit in this rule that the monetary policies must find the natural rate of interest, and that if you change the real rate of interest, for instance, if you increase the real rate of interest, this will necessarily lead to a fall in output. And so this is the way that economy can come back to an equilibrium level, and also the reasons why to lean against the wind, as the Taylor rule prescribes. In this, so the Taylor rule and the model behind it, we can say it is a restatement of the loanable funds theory, viewing the market rate of interest as determined by the supply of and the demand for credit, and the natural rate by the supply of and demand for savings when output is at its potential level. As in Robertson, or also in Wicksell and other authors, in the absence of disturbances and rigidities, the real rate of interest would eventually adjust to the value, assuming a full employment, and since profit expectations would govern the demand for credit, the marginal productivity of capital would shape the interest, rate. Now, the loanable funds theory was already criticized by Keynes, who questioned the fact that investment adjusts to saving through changes in interest rates. And what we want now to stress, and that Keynes' criticism to the traditional theory has been reinforced by the capital debate of the 1960s that showed that it is impossible to derive a decreasing supply curve of and if we look to this debate, there are some points that must be stressed with reference to the Taylor rule. In particular, that you may have multiple equilibria in the saving investment market, a capital labor ratio that in equilibrium is not necessarily higher for a lower interest rate, and changes in the interest rate out of the equilibrium that are so strong that they question the validity of the theory. And what the criticism that stems from capital debate of the 60s, what this criticism calls into questions is the idea of a natural rate of interest determined by productivity and thrift to be found by the monetary policies, namely exactly what the Taylor rule would prescribe. And it also calls into question the neoclassical mechanism granting the tendencies of actual to potential output, and with this, the focusing of the new classical and new Keynesian models on the volatility of output, namely on its variance, on the assumption that the output gap will be closed by market forces. And in this way, it is hidden, for instance, that potential output may fall during the crisis due to a destruction of productive capacity that stems from a fall in effective demand. All these that we find in the Taylor rule. First of all, in actual facts by several studies on, for instance, the elasticity, the fact that the elasticity of output. Second, if you abandon the determination of classical or marginalist theory, you can also, for instance, that changes in the rate of interest will lead to changes in the same direction of the level in the Taylor rule. The problem is, okay, if this is the criticism to the Taylor rule, in any case, price inflation. And with respect to the Federal Reserve, to the European Central Bank, to the Bank of Japan, stress that some kind of interpret this point in a way So what happened? Chat.
Hello, Sergio.
Yes.
I'm afraid we're having some connection problems here. Can you please share your screen again? You're back now. Perhaps Ricardo can help you. It's in the bottom of the screen. There's a button and you just click it.
I see.
Okay, cool.
Questa? Yes, okay. But again.
Okay, cool.
Okay, now?
Well, I think it's working now.
Okay. So, what we can use of the studies on the central banks with respect to their reactivity to price inflation. It is not mechanical that the monetary policies depend from a set of other circumstances, for instance, the condition of the financial markets, the limits put by the zero lower bound, the idea of a conventional or normal rate of interest. In some circumstances, an activist policy, it depends from the historical periods that we are analyzing. And also that of course, price stability is important from central bank when we view them, for instance, as acting as the manager of the bank club, defending the lenders against inflation and strengthening the international position of the domestic financial sector. And also when we consider, for instance, the external constraints and the effect of inflation on rents and fixed incomes. And in this sense, we can see the target real interest rate by the central bank. Now I use a word by Lehman Satterfield that I like very much, as a sort of subjective target by the central banks, which in some sense is masquerade in the mind of central bankers and also in the communication to the public by some objective features of the economy. This leads to Keynes' idea of the rate of interest as a conventional phenomenon that is at the root of the idea that monetary policy may influence income distribution. And this opened the problem to try to give an interpretation of this reactivity of the central bank to price alternative to that we find in the Taylor rule. Before coming to show how the Taylor rule may be interpreted in an alternative framework, we may, however, briefly consider some alternative interpretation of it, which on the contrary continue to refer to a long-run rate of interest as determined by real factors, albeit different from productivity and thrift. And these are the models of Dumenil and Levy that see this natural rate of interest as determined by the real wages and the methods of production, as in Ricardo or Marx, and that of Stockhammer that refer to the adjustment of the rate of unemployment to the value for which inflation does not accelerate. In both cases, the Taylor rule has only a stabilizing role, and monetary policy is viewed as neutral, at least in the long run, as in the interpretation of the Taylor rule that we find in the New Keynesian models.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sergio. So I will briefly discuss some contribution from non-mainstream authors. These are the main references of my talk. Well, first of all, why are we discussing this now? Well, because we more or less find plausible the idea that monetary authorities tend to react to excessive inflation by increasing the interest rates. And we would like to see the implication of plugging this more or less plausible monetary rule in a less mainstream context. And so we are interested, given that we are also interested in trying to understand possible implication in terms of income distribution of a Taylor-like rule, we were looking for inspiration by this kind of contribution that are less in line with the new, at least apparently less in line with the new consensus approach. So at first, let's begin with the very famous 1999 article by Dumenil and Levy, two Marxist economists. Well, it's important to begin by making explicit that monetary policy was not the main focus of their interest, not the main focus of their research, but they do need monetary policy for a very specific reason. Well, the debate is a very long debate in capital and accumulation theories, and the debate is whether there is or not a mechanism that ensures that the economy converge to a fully adjust position, what they define as a classical equilibrium, which is a long-run equilibrium where the degree of capacity utilization is equal to the normal cost minimizing one. So the response given by Dumenil and Levy is yes, but it's not an endogenous mechanism provided by the economic system. What you need, it's an appropriate behavior, an appropriate reaction of the central bank. And this reaction of the central bank, it's something that resembles closely the Taylor rule. So their conclusion is that at the end of the day, you can be Keynesian in the short term, meaning that in the short term, you can try to increase aggregate demand and by this increase output, but in the long run, the path of growth is entirely shaped by behavioral parameters like the propensity to save of capitalists and the existing technology. As we will try to argue, and as somebody else has argued, at the end of the day, the story is very, very similar to a pretty standard new consensus model. Okay, so very, very briefly, as we were discussing, as I was telling you, the reaction function, so the more or less the Taylor rule they use, has only the role of driving the traverse toward the classical long-run equilibrium. So as I will show you, in the long run, you still have neutrality of money. Let me give you also a qualification how they define long-run equilibrium. It's an equilibrium where prices of production display a uniform rate of profit and the degree of capacity utilization is equal to the normal one. So you have at first a very, very rigid central bank reaction function according to which monetary policy do not want any inflation. So monetary policy makers react to any inflation rate, okay? So then you have a more or less standard accumulation function that depends positively on the degree of capacity utilization and negatively on the real interest rate. You have a saving function that it's an accounting identity that reflects the assumption that only capitalist saves. You also have a kind of short-run IS curve that it's negatively influenced by the interest rate because of the postulated influence on the accumulation function. And then you have a very important one, which is equation 5, that is nothing more than a non-vertical old school Phillips curve. And you have the assumption that prices are extremely flexible. Okay, so as soon as demand exceeds normal capacity output, there is not an adjustment in capacity because actually you are using capacity at the best you can. The burden of the adjustment is on prices, okay? As I was telling you, monetary variables and the rate of it, well, in their analysis, the instrument is money supply, but you can the same story with the interest rate. The only role is to guide the economy towards the long-run position where the economy grows at the rate of growth that it's basically the warranted rate. So in the long run, you are supposed not to have any inflation and you have a normal utilization of your capacity. Okay, so, but in any case, if you try to make the story a bit more plausible, for example, just allowing for an inflation target that it's not the inflation target equals to 0, which is quite implausible, and you try to introduce also cost inflation, which is pi c in the equation 5b's, what you get is that when you are in the long-run equilibrium, meaning that you are in a position where inflation is equal to the inflation target, you have a normal degree of capacity utilization only if by chance, or because you are very, very able in computing this, you have a target which is equal to the cost inflation. Okay, so basically there is, and I'm quoting Lavoie and Chrysler in the last paragraph of this slide, it's not something in the nature of the economy or in the nature of the model. You don't have an intrinsic adjustment role. Okay. Please. I'm not sure if somebody's trying to say something or it's. Okay.
No. Carry on.
Okay, thank you. No, we have a question from the audience.
Just to specify, what is the transmission mechanism?
Okay. Okay. So from the audience, Professor Palumbo asked me which is the transmission mechanism of the monetary policy. Okay, in case you haven't heard. Well, the story, it's the standard story that if you see that you have inflation, you want to drive the economy back to the long-run position, so you raise the interest rates, and this slows down accumulation. Okay, so you have an impact on investment, yes. Actually, in the published version, you have that their instrument is the money supply. But at the end of the day, the story is the same. In any case, in a working paper version, they directly discuss if this operates through interest rate, but it's a pretty standard story. Okay. Okay, so very, very briefly, the only way you can satisfy all the requirements that Jumenil and Levy require having an inflation target equal to 0. Well, but okay, please tell me if you miss me, because I see a message like you're in. Okay, nothing. Basically, what you need to have is fundamentally, okay, so if you replace reaction function by introducing also consideration of some sort of output gap as the B8U minus UN in equation 7, well, if you try to solve this model, what you get is that central bank reacts not only to level of the inflation rate, but also to changes in the inflation rate. Okay, so this, if you try to reconcile a long-run equilibrium as they define it with an equilibrium target different from 0, with a positive inflation target. Okay, because otherwise, if you drop the assumption of the inflation target equal to 0, you will not converge toward an equilibrium with U equal to UN. Okay, so in order to obtain this result, what you need is to add a vertical Phillips curve to the model, and what you get, it's nothing more a version of the new consensus model that Sergio showed us in the first set of slides. So this is just to conclude on Jumenil and Levy. So we were looking for some inspiration of alternative applications of the Taylor rule. And for the moment, we are not satisfied with what they propose, because they propose the same story. So we have to look for something else. Okay, before we move to 2 more proposals that I will discuss very, very briefly, this is also a summary of some post-Keynesian critiques to new consensus models, but that in principle might be applied also to Jumenil and Levy. So this is also a summary of our reasons for being dissatisfied with what they found, Well, at first, as you might know very well, since the controversy on capital, the negative influence of the interest rate on aggregate investment, it's reasons for skepticism for us. Well, of course, you can, and we will investigate other channels, for example, through consumptions, through the debt burden on consumption, but this is something we leave to further research. Well, then, as we all more or less know, we more or less recognize, monetary policy tend to be a weak, a blunt instrument, not to mention the Gibson paradox Sergio already mentioned. Well, moreover, we don't have in mind any neutral or natural rate of interest, so we don't have this kind of determinism. And obviously, we don't believe in the long-run neutrality of money. Well, Lavoie and Chrysler also list among the critiques the fact that you should allow for also a long-run endogenous determination of the degree of capacity utilization in the long run, but at least I'm not so sure that this is the divide between what we propose and what is problematic. And then obviously we also are skeptical towards a vertical Phillips curve, and also we have also reasons to doubt about a necessary short-run trade-off between gross domestic product and inflation, as long as you can increase your degree of capacity utilization and display a large elasticity in your production. that allows you to accommodate production with accommodate further demand without any need to raise prices. Okay, so now let's move to something more post-Keynesian in the spirit. So we leave the classical Marxian approach of Dumin and Levy. I will briefly touch upon two twins contribution by Stockhammer. So let's begin with something that we more or less agree with. Well, so wages. Well, okay, I'm gonna say something that I will more or less deny in the next slides. So in the mind of all of us, wages tend to be the outcome of the bargaining between capitalists and workers. But I'm not so sure that we can defend this in the next models, even if we are obviously very persuaded about that, but I will get back on that. Then obviously we tend to have a different hierarchies of markets with respect to mainstream orders. So unemployment tends to be determined by the equilibrium on the goods market, so tends to be determined by aggregate demand. Well, if unemployment is lower than this rate of unemployment that does not engender inflation, what you will have an increase in the workers' bargaining power that give rise to wage inflation, because, you know, if unemployment tends to be lower than the Nairo, there is less control on workers, and worker can exert more pressure. Moreover, well, okay, perhaps this can be discussed later in a clearest way. Okay, but let me introduce it. Well, in principle, what we can expect is that for low levels of inflations, there is not necessarily a negative relationship between aggregate demand and inflation. But on the other hand, if you introduce some monetary policy rule, you will see that something like that happens. And indeed, I will show you aggregate demand curves that are downward sloping in the employment inflation diagram, exactly because of central bank reaction function in the spirit of the Taylor rule. Okay. So what we can see is that in these models, the adjustment and the traverse towards the Nairo is not induced by some economic mechanism, not natural, okay, but by some endogenous economic mechanism, but to specific prescribed policy reactions. And I will show you what happens if we drop the assumption of a central bank reacting in this way. So basically, we more or less share this kind of approach, and this is a starting point that seems quite promising for our interest. But so what we were doing is trying to imagine how to formalize these processes, and again, we try to look at other formalization to draw some inspirations. So at first, what I'm going to discuss very, very briefly, without entering much into detail, it's a contribution by Stockhammer of 2011. In particular, what he presents is a kind of wage norm argument, according to which, well, the story it's quite easy to tell. If the economy stays off the equilibrium, so if the wage stays off some kind of wage equilibrium, workers will more or less get used to this new level of wages, and their autonomous wage claims, their wage norm, will tend to shift and tend to converge towards the actual wage situation. And this brings with itself that also the natural rates, the Nairo, which is basically defined in terms of the autonomous claims of capitalists and workers, will tend to move towards the actual rate of unemployment. So the story seems more or less plausible. Again, the problem, at least in our view, the problem is that still, in order to make the story works, once you write down the equations and you draw the diagram, is that this kind of argument, at least achieving this kind of arguments with the model I'm going to show you, strongly requires and heavily relies on the fact that you assume a downward sloping labor demand curve, okay? And well, we know that if you are skeptical about the existence of an aggregate production function, if you are aware with all the problems with the aggregation of capital, well, you have also specular problems in the labor market. So there is not a straightforward there is not a way at all to depict a downward sloping labor demand curve. So just to be clear, what I'm going to show, okay, what you can see here, the downward sloping curve, it's not strictly a labor demand curve, but it's at the end of the day a pseudo labor demand curve. This is a price setting curve, okay? So behavior of oligopolistic firms, okay? What you can see in any case is that when the rate of employment increases, the real wage that entrepreneurs are willing to give tends to diminish. And the only plausible explanation we can find, I guess, is that you are assuming that you have a decreasing marginal product of labor. I think this is not just a suspect, because in the remaining of the, let me define. Okay, so on the axis, we have employment on the horizontal axis and the real wage, sorry, on the vertical axis. What you have is the increasing curve is a wage bargaining curve. Okay, so it's the wage that workers claim, and it's an increasing function of the rate of employment. Okay, if employment increases, they feel empowered and they claim for a higher wage. Obviously, the intercepts on the vertical axis reflect their so-called autonomous claims. While on the other end, the downward sloping curve is the price setting curve, again, which is at the end of the day, nothing more in our view than a labor demand curve. And this interpretation, it's also confirmed by the fact that in the remaining of the discussion in the article, for example, the author says that if you invest more, if you have more capital, what you have is that you have an increase in the marginal productivity of labor. So this is clear that in the background of this argument as well, you have a standard downward sloping labor demand curve. So we have another question from the audience, okay?
You said that the sloping, the decreasing curve is necessary as the result of value engineering.
Yes.
But why not just a horizontal price setting?
Actually, in the second.
I agree with you that there is something very.
No.
I sympathize very much, but.
Oh, okay. Okay. Now I will give you an answer on this, and then I will also show you in the next. I will try to sketch in the next model I present you an approach that does not need the downward sloping curve. Okay. So, well, the story is, but let me add, sorry, I have to okay, I will give you a direct answer on that, but let me rephrase your question to the audience. So Professor Palumbo asked me, why is necessary that the price setting curve is downward sloping in order to have an endogenous Nairo? Okay, this was her question. Well, let me at first explain how the story works, and then I will try to argue that this is necessary in order to have the endogeneity of the Nairo. Well, at first, well, I hope to have a blackboard in order to draw all the diagrams, but we don't have it. So, but in any case, above this diagram, you are supposed to have also a diagram which depicts the good market equilibrium. Okay, so above from this picture, we are supposed to have an aggregate demand curve and several short-run Phillips curve. But in any case, so this is the story. So let's assume that you have a negative demand shock. Okay, so from the point T0, you move to T1. Okay, you also need to assume, in his view, that this negative demand shock comes with an increase in the real wage, which is at the end of the day quite strange. Okay, then what happens? Given that you have an increase in the real wage, because you are assuming that out of the equilibrium, the price that matters is the price decided by capitalists, okay, which makes a lot of sense at the end of the day. So given that you are assuming that the decrease, that the negative demand shock comes with an increase in the real wage, you can argue that, okay, once workers are in a position like T1, they get used to a higher real wage. So they begin pushing for a higher wage, meaning that they have a shift upward in their autonomous income claims. So given that they have experienced it for a while and higher real wage, by assumption, you can argue that the wage bargaining curve shift upwards, and you have the intersection between these two curves occurring at a lower rate of employment, meaning occurring at a higher new NAIRU. If you didn't have a downward sloping curve, you will not have at all an increase in the wage, in the real wage. With no increase in the real wage, workers do not have any reason to, this is my interpretation, okay? If you do not have any increase in the real wage, there is no reason for having an increase in the autonomous wage claim, so the wage bargaining curve doesn't move, and at the end of the day, there is no change, no endogenous change in the NAIRU. With an horizontal one. Horizontal one. If you drop. Sorry, we have another question from the audience. Well, a vertical. What would the vertical price setting curve? Okay, Professor Ciccone asked me, what happens if we have a vertical price setting curve? Okay, and if a vertical price setting curve would work with this kind of argument. Well, but which will be the why entrepreneurs should have a but this is not the aggregate demand curve. This is the curve is the price behavior curve of capitalists. So it's just basically really a labor demand curve. But yeah, but you see the exogenous increase in the real wage with the other set of curves, because the downward sloping is the curve that describes the behavior of entrepreneurs. Yes.
Otherwise, if you have constant returns, for example, and you assume a simple markup equation, you will have
so given this, again, we're not completely satisfied with this tentative approach either. So let me jump to my last slide, my last two slides. Okay, so now we are moving to a previous contribution by Stockhammer, a contribution of 2008, a contribution that I would say does not require this kind of downward sloping price setting curve or labor demand curve. Well, I will say that more or less everything sounds plausible. I show you only the fundamental equations, okay, because we don't have time for the fully fledged model. Well, what you have, the first two are the claims of the two different classes, okay? So you have that the wage claims are a negative function of the rate of unemployment, which makes sense. The rate of unemployment is function of aggregate demand. Then you have the profit claims. As you can see, what we have here is, in some sense, a fixed profit claim. So you don't have anything like the decreasing things we have seen in the previous slide. But these are what workers and capitalists claim. Then you have what capitalists and workers get. What do they get depends mainly on the unanticipated rate of inflation. So these are basically the third and the fourth equation there. The realized wage and profit share. At first, I was a bit surprised by the fact that unexpected inflation decreases both the share of capitalists and the share of workers. But perhaps I was surprised at first, but then we discussed a little bit. Perhaps it's not so implausible. I mean, perhaps it's not so implausible. Okay.
The terms used by Stockhammer.
Yeah, which is a bit puzzling, but the story is okay. I claim 60%, you claim 55. If it's too much, inflation more or less tries to reconcile the fact that capitalists and workers are claiming too much. It's a bit strange because in principle, capitalists are assumed to be oligopolistic, so they set prices, but the idea is that they are not necessarily able to fully protect themselves by wage inflation, okay? Then you have an argument for the endogeneity of dinero that in plain words tends to be similar than the previous one. Well, what you have, well, how I'd like to explain it in an intuitive and simple way. Well, the story more or less is the following. In which case workers will increase W0, that is their autonomous wage claim. Okay, perhaps no, sorry. This one, okay, this is the law, the behavioral law that explains us in which cases we have an increase in the autonomous wage claims. So quite intuitively, again, if workers see that their realized wage share is higher than the wage share they claimed, well, they understand that they can push for something more, okay? Something that it's more or less reasonable. The trouble in our view, or in my view at least, is that this happens when unemployment is higher. And if you buy the model, more or less makes sense. Because look at equations 1 and 3. What happens is that if unemployment is very high, meaning if unemployment is higher than the Nairo, what you get is that you have an unexpected change in inflation, which is a decrease in inflation. So given that you have a decrease in inflation, what you get, it's more than what you claimed. So if the situation of unemployment is bad, paradoxically, workers get more than what they claim, okay? So given this, what you can see is that when unemployment is higher than the Nairo, you will experiment an increase in the autonomous wage claims of workers. So you will have an increase in W0, but the same holds true also for the profit claims. Given that W0 and Pi0 are the two components of the Nairo, which is this equation, you see that if unemployment is higher than the Nairo itself tends to increase. What puzzles us more or less is that the equations more or less make sense, but what you see is quite the opposite of what we would expect, you know, in telling us a plausible story. We have to think about that a little bit, but still there is something that's not completely persuasive. Well, let me show you just the last diagram. What you see, I took this picture from the Stockhammer 2008 paper. You have two IS curves. One, it's upward sloping, the dotted UIS curve. This simply reflects the fact that if you do not assume that central bank reacts to increasing levels of inflation, you might have that demands respond positively to increasing levels of inflation because it relieves the burden of debt, for example, okay? While on the other hand, if you assume a Taylor rule-like rule at work, you see that the IS curve rotates and becomes downward sloping, and the model is able to produce a stable outcome. But perhaps I will leave it here and leave it to Sergio.
Yes, we have considered the model of Stockhammers and other post-Keynesian models about Nero and also the set of prices by firms, because we have that they can give us some suggestions about how monetary policy can influence income distributions and how monetary policy react to price inflation. I want to stress that the reference to a rate of unemployment compounding the claims of workers and capitalists on income distribution, namely denaro, does not refer to other meanings of denaro, in the sense that we don't think that when we speak of the so-called Nero, that is a rate of unemployment where the output is equal to potential output. Is a completely different things in our idea. In what we are going to say, we do not refer now to oligopolistic markets, and we think that the nominal markup on prices, in a sense, set by firms, is set by the central bank, by the nominal rate of interest. And for the sake of simplicity, in what we are going now to say, that is a very preliminary work, we don't, we assume that there is no change in labor productivity for the sake of simplicity, and that there is no change in the normal profits of enterprise. If you look at price systems, you can show that if firms adjust prices to the historical cost of capital, when wages rises, you can have, for a given nominal rate of interest, an increase in the real wages. This increase in the real wages will be temporary in nature if there is only a una tantum increase in money wages, but is permanent if there is a continuous over time increase in money wages, leading the real wages to the level corresponding to the real interest rates, equal, of course, to the difference between the nominal interest rate and the rate of inflation. Of course, this increase in the real wages, that is, this decrease in the real rate of interest, will not happen if the central banks react, adjusting the nominal rate of interest in order to leave unchanged the real rate of interest to a target level, to a warranted desired real rate of interest by the central bank. Now, if this is the situation and workers in this case do not manage to achieve their target wage rate, of course, they, in the next time, they will ask an increase in money wages greater than before. And so, if they ask an increase in money wages greater than gamma, where gamma is the previous increase in money wages, given the discrepancy between what is their real wage rate warranted in wage bargaining and the actual real wage rate, the rate of inflation will increase, precisely for the increase in money wages greater than before. And if, again, the central bank react, trying to maintain and change the real rate of interest, you will live, in this case, a continuous accelerating price inflation. What in a way very similar to what said before by Riccardo, you will have, of course, that the actual real wage rate will depend from the reactivity, both of money wages and the nominal interest rate, to this continuous increase in prices. And so now I show this in this simple way. You can but for a demonstration more strong, we are still working on it. In this case, the real wage rate that will be achieved in wage bargaining, that we can find when the expected rate of inflation is equal to actual rate of inflation, will be a wage average between the real wage rate warranted by the workers in wage bargaining and that real wage rate that correspond to the interest real, the real rate of interest targeted by the central bank. And so we can have something similar, but in this case with an horizontal line and not with a downward sloping curve of what showed before by Riccardo. We can think of a wage claim curves, the rising one, that is behind the claims of the workers in wage bargaining, and that can depends from the rate of employment A, for what is the share of the workforce that is belong to trade unions, and social and institutional factors, and so on. Of course, any change in epsilon 0, in epsilon 2, in the last terms now, we do not have that because I have assumed a rate of change of productivity equal to 0, but any change in the parameters of the curve, of course, will shift the curve. We will have a real wage rate that is corresponding to the real rate of interest targeted by the monetary, by the central bank. And so, of course, the intersection between these two curves will determine a rate of employment that is able to reconcile the claims of workers on one side and the claims, in a sense, of the central banks on the other side. If the rate of employment is not at that level, of course, you have discrepancies between the claims of the workers and the claims of the central bank. And what will happen is a continuous increase in the rate of inflation. Indeed, you will have that these curves that are Phillips curves will continuously shift upwards, because you will have continuously a change in the expected rate of inflation, because you will have a continuous increasing nominal rate of interest over time, so that if the real rate of interest is constant, you will have a continuous increase in the rate of inflation for the increase in the nominal rate of interest. That is the way in which the central banks react to the tentative of the workers to obtain his wage claims. And so, of course, this is not a stable situation, and something must happen. And what will happen, in a sense, will depend, according to the circumstances, from, for instance, the strength of workers in wage bargaining, from consideration that can influence the set of monetary policies. For instance, the effects of a continuous increase in price inflation on external equilibrium, on the incomes of on fixed incomes, and so on. And so you can have a situation in which, for instance, the central banks accept a low corresponding to the real rate of interest targeted by the central bank, or otherwise you will have a shift in the curve that represent the wage claims by the worker. And now what we are doing is, of course, to try to understand better all of these things, and also to try to outline some different possible regimes. For instance, as in the 1970s, a gradualism in the monetary policies. So the central banks does not react strongly to the increase in price inflation, and the real rate of interest become even negative. And this is the case in which, in a sense, the central bank change its target towards the target of workers in wage bargaining. Or you can have a sort of cooperative game, as in some corporatist regimes, where you have a tentative by both workers, government, and central banks to try to adjust the things, in a sense, the claims, the different claims between them. Or you can have a cold turkey, as in the end of the 70s, when the central banks rises strongly the rate of interest in order to determine something. And now I am not completely convinced of my work, to determine an adjustment of the wage claims of the workers towards a higher real rate of interest. In all these things, also the inflation target of the central banks may have a role, in the sense that you can have, for the same real rate of interest, many inflation rates. And of course, if the inflation rates targeted by the central bank shift and become lower, these necessarily have some effects on the behavior of central banks. For instance, choosing to a cold turkey kind of monetary policy. In all of this, of course, we have a problem that it is a problem that is also behind our criticism of, for instance, the model of Lavoie, not of Lavoie, of Duménil and Lévy, or also of Stockhammers. Namely, in what sense, if we speak of the reaction, this reaction of the monetary policy to price inflation by change the rate of interest, if this change will actually affect the level of output, and so the level of employment, and so we can, in a sense, adjust the claims between workers and capitalists in wage bargaining. So this is, of course, a very important point. We know that we cannot think about a necessary inverse relations between the rate of interest and aggregate demand. There are, of course, some other effects that you can consider, however. Perhaps also, if not so strong, there is an effect of changes in the rate of interest on consumption expenditure for different channels. You can also consider the effects of unexpected changes of the rate of interest on financial markets, with changes in the price of bonds and shares and the effects that this can have on also on the spending decisions of households. And then, but we are, I think there is here something that somebody that can say us, give us some clarification on these points. It could be also interesting to analyze if the change in the interest rate may have some effect of the degree of the warranted degree degree of capacity utilizations, and from this way to effective demand. This is a point suggested by Scott, by Frank, and by Hader in the literatures, and I think that it can be an interesting point. Of course, these are only very initial points of analysis, in the sense we are more convinced about our analysis of the limits of the Taylor rule, of the limits of the estimates of the natural rate, of the limits of the interpretation of the Taylor rule referring to a loanable funds theory. And we are also convinced about the criticism to models as that of Dumenil-Levy with respect to a different interpretation of the Taylor rule. We have these analytical problems that are not little problem that we must further analyze. And so this is all, and if there is some questions, we are happy about this.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, this is Rafael. Thank you very much for your talk. I believe now it's time for us to open for questions from the floor. You can open for questions from your audience first, and then we open for questions from the young scholars watching.
Okay, perfect.
Right, so yeah, we make one question. You want to make one question?
Questions from the audience?
Some questions about, if I remember well, it was the model by
just a moment, that we must, Ricardo must come here now.
Oh, you can just translate the question if you want.
Oh, yes, yes, now we translate the question, yes.
In that model, what is the path of some sort of normal growth path, which I expect does not correspond to any cooling point later. So how is it determined? What is that case enough or normal?
Okay, Professor Ciccone asked in Dumenil-Levy, which is the equilibrium natural normal rate of growth. Well, the rate of growth, if you assume that the propensity to save of capitalists is 1, is the rate of profit. I will need a blackboard, but or in any case, if you drop this assumption, it's the standard warranted rate by Harrod. So it's the propensity to save divided by the technology.
Determination of accumulation on the basis of savings.
Absolutely.
Direction from savings.
But yeah, Professor Ciccone is arguing that so the direction of accumulation is driven by savings, yes, but they are willing to admit that as well. So in the long run, what matters is the supply side of the economy that drives the economy in the long run. So for this, you can be, yes, in the short run, you can try by means of demand increases, increasing the level of wage to increase output. But in the long run, you end up with the sales law, basically. But this is something that I assume they are willing to admit without any trouble.
In fact, I have a question actually. the thing is, I don't know if you have any reference on this issue actually, because to be honest, I'm not really knowledgeable about the topic, but I've never seen actually a paper, at least in post-Keynesian tradition, taking into account the cost push effect of interest rates on the nominal exchange rate, and through the transmission channel of the pass-through mechanism, of the exchange rate pass-through mechanism. Once you raise interest rates, nominal interest rates, you attract capital inflows, and then you overvalue your currency, and through the cost push channel, you actually reduce inflation and also reduce the level of economic activity or the level of utilization, of capacity utilization. And in this case, I think, to which extent do you think it's important to include the theoretical framework of income distribution and the Taylor rule as well into an open economic framework in order to address the issue of cost push inflation through the exchange rate pass-through mechanism? I don't know if it was clear, my question.
Yeah, no, the question was clear. I don't let me begin, and then I leave the microphone to Sergio. I don't know a precise answer, but I assume that there is obviously something that can be derived from all the Tirwell law and so on literature on the fact that, yeah, of course, by means of raising or lowering the rate of interest, you can act on the inflow or outflows of capital, of financial capital. Yeah, we haven't discussed that between us, so I can't give you perhaps a satisfactory answer, but it's definitely something we should look at. And I guess that, again, the McCombie, Tirwell and Dixon and so on and so forth could give us some inspiration, but we haven't looked into that yet. Let me leave the microphone to Sergio if he wants to add something.
Rafael?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes. Yes, we have not worked a lot about what happened with reference to an open economy, and I have only these suggestions about it with respect to what we have said in the last slides about the reaction of central bank to price inflation. I think that in this sense there will be you can have contrasting effects on monetary policy, in the sense that with respect to the trade balance, what is relevant, of course, is the effect of cost push on prices, and from this way on exports. And on the other side, with respect to capital movements, what is important, of course, is the nominal rate of interest and the expected change of the rate of exchange. And so you can have a situation in which the effect of the influence of the effects of price inflation on the decision of monetary policies may be very different according to what is the weight of these different channels. But anyway, it's something on which we have not worked. We have not worked a lot. If I am not sure to have understood your question, if it is the relevance of open movement of capitals and the external and trade balance on the monetary policies. Is it so?
Yes, that's correct. Well, we can move on to another question, actually, from your audience, and then we collect another ones from here. But thank you very much for your answer.
So, Antonella Palumbo, Professor Antonella Palumbo of Roma 3.
First of all, thank you very much. It's incredibly interesting, and I think it is a very, very useful work. And I agree with everything you said on the critical side, both on standard models and on alternative models. About the mechanisms that you are looking for, even if I completely agree with your caution against the decreasing demand curve of investment. So, of course, I agree that there is absolutely no mechanical relationship between rate of interest and investment. But probably you should consider that in practice there might be an asymmetry in the way
yes. If you rise the interest rate, so you lower the interest, yes.
Because you restrict the amount of credit that more or less, or at least you make it more costly. So there might be, not of course any mechanical, but maybe it's something to consider, even if I don't know how. And about the last question that you received now, I think that it is very important.
The external constraint.
Not the external constraint, exactly. But it is true that central banks in practice are very much influenced by the external value of the capital. So it's not about the balance of trade, but the capital movements. So maybe it is true that the rate of interest has to go up sometimes because and it is an indirect mechanism to check. And this is what
no, summarize you. It's better. Your English is better than mine.
Okay, I have to summarize a very long and interesting question and point by Professor Palumbo. Well, she pointed basically two things that we should consider. The first one is that even if we are all persuaded that there is no mechanical relation between the interest rate and aggregate demand, still we need to consider some sort of asymmetry, meaning that, you know, when you raise the interest rate, this might depress the economy in a way or another, while if you lower it, that might not work as effectively as in the other direction. And then she also basically confirmed Raphael's intuition and suggested us to look more into these international economics issues, because actually central banks do really care a lot about the value, the external value of their currency. So I think this is a reason more not to take the Taylor rule so mechanically as might be prima facie by this kind of models. Did I summarize it? Thank you. So yes,
yes, I think I agree with you on both points, in the sense that I believe that there is an uncertain, but especially an asymmetric effect of monetary policy on aggregate demand. And and perhaps, as shown also by the recent experience after the 2007 crisis, perhaps the effects of lowering the rate of interest on aggregate demand is lower than the effects of rising the rate of interest on aggregate demand. And in this sense, I think that there is a lot of work to be done, for instance, on the effects of changes in the rate of interest on the financial conditions of firms, in particular of different sizes and so on, that perhaps can give us some indications that this is a very important point of the in the transmission channels of monetary policy. With respect to the yes, the external positions of of a country, yes, from since Keynes onwards, when Keynes wrote in the general theory that the interest of the City of London was very important for setting the monetary policies of the Bank of England. Yes, I think that what is the value of a currency is very important in setting the monetary policies and the rate of interest. And also for the decision of monetary policies, the reactions to price inflation and changes in the exchange rates. And so I agree with you about this. With respect to our specific point, we should clarify the link between what happened to price inflation within the country and the value of the currency. So the effects of this price inflation to the exchange rate, because the valuation of the exchange rate, depreciation of the exchange rate, of course, can push the central banks to raise the rate of interest in order to defend the value of the currency. Because in a sense, this is an aspect of the fact that central bank, as Godard said, act as the managers of bank club. The interest of the banks are not only in, yes, of course, it is on have the greater real rate of interest that they can have. And this is the first point. And also the financial interest want to have a strong currency to acquire assets, foreign assets and so on. So I think that is a very important point to be discussed. But for our specific point, with respect to the reaction function to prices of the central banks is less important. Is important for the emphasis that there are a set of circumstances that guide monetary policies. And so for the emphasis on the fact that in the sense, some sort of tailored rule, but some sort of tailored rule is only, as said by Blinder, by Bernac, by everything, by Greenspan. I can quote you many passages of Greenspan about this, is only a benchmark, a sort of policy system, but nothing mechanical, okay? Because you have these other circumstances that influence monetary policy. Okay, so, Rafael?
Hello?
Yes.
Well, we don't have any questions here from the students. I have a question, but I would like to give another one a chance to ask. So, I mean, you can ask people there in the audience to pose questions.
Yes, we have a couple of questions here.
So yeah, okay, go ahead.
If it's long, perhaps it's better if you speak.
No, my one is very short and very specific. Professor Levero, in the first part of the seminar, surveyed different specifications of Taylor rules, which have been overestimated by several authors.
Yes.
But I recognize that there is sometimes different parameters which has been estimated or assumed, I don't know. To what extent and how the literature motivated such surprising and relevant changes in the parameter of the output gap and the inflation gap? It is discussed in the literature or not?
Yes, it is discussed. In a sense, I think that there are two kinds of answers. One
Sorry,
asks,
Sergio, sorry. Can
yes?
can you please repeat the question? Sorry, you couldn't hear.
Oh, yes. I pass the microphone to Riccardo.
So the question was direct. Well, if you look at this slide, we have different formulations of the Taylor rule. And as you can see, according to the different formulation, you have different parameters, different weights attached to the inflation gap and the output gap. So Walter was asking, okay, but is in the literature discussed why parameters change so much among one version and the other?
There are two kinds of answer on your question. The first one referred to the prescriptive role of the Taylor rule, in the sense that, for instance, the parameters about the reaction of central bank to inflation rate and to output gap, they are seen as reflecting different loss functions of the central banks, from which you will have different parameters. For example, if you have a higher parameter of reaction to output gap, it means that the central bank is more give a greater weight also to output situations. And so, you know, this is the first point. If you see the literature on the optimal monetary rule, if according to the value of phi, that is the reactivity of the central bank on output gap, you have different, in a sense, different regimes of monetary policies, okay? Different regimes. This is one point. The second point, of course, is the theoretical models behind the Taylor rule. When you have, for instance, in the Taylor rule, a forward-looking Taylor rule, where you are the expected rate of inflation within the theory, is because in the theoretical model, you have a Phillips curve in which you will find exactly that kind of assumption of expected inflation. So according to the theoretical model, you have different specifications. Of course, there are also other answers that are more near to, in a sense, reality. For instance, why you must you must not adjust prices only looking at current inflation, because it can be a temporary change. Because if you adjust now the rate of interest, you are not sure that the effects of the rise of the rate of interest will be now, but it can be, you can have lags in the effects of monetary interest. So what you must do, this is in the current discussion of the central banks, what you must do is try to understand what will be the rate of inflation, I don't know, 3 quarters ahead and so on. And according to what you think about the lags of effects of monetary policies on output. And so you must not change the rate of interest. And this is also the reason, the justification for gradualism, in the sense you must change slowly the rate of interest. So in the specification in which, for instance, you have a weight of the past nominal rate of interest, and so you adjust slowly the rate of interest to changes of inflation and the output gap. this is for the same reasons, because you think that, you know, you must see exactly what happened. I think that in actual facts, the central banks are more conscious of what, in a sense, of how works the economy than the theoretical models. And so this gradualism is because they know that to change too rapidly the rate of interest, you can have very important effects on financial stability and so on. And so the direction is always slow. You can see what is happening now in the United States, for instance. The discussion now to what extent to rise the rate of interest and so on is precisely on this point. And they are rising the rate of interest very slowly indeed. And in particular, the real rate of interest, because you have now a rate of inflation in the United States that is now around 2%, but the real rate of interest is rising very, very slowly. Okay, so this is my answer.
Perhaps we have another question from our audience, if it's okay for you.
Yes, go ahead.
The question is in Italian because we have the official translator that is Riccardo.
First time in my life that I work as a translator. Vai.
Un attimo, determinato il salario di salario. Cioè, se accettiamo l'idea che il salario di salario è il risultato non così grafico, dove c'hai la curva di contrattazione.
Scusa, ma dopo allora.
This one, okay.
This is Stockhammers 2008.
Se accettiamo l'idea che il salario è il risultato della contrattazione, a me non sembra, cioè una possibile critica che si può fare è che la determinazione del salario non può essere come lo spiega nel modello Stockhammer. Se siamo in un modello neoclassico in cui il salario è uguale al prodotto marginale del lavoro, allora T1 effettivamente è la determinazione del salario. Ma se siamo nell'idea che dipende dalla forza contrattuale dei lavoratori e dei capitalisti, la determinazione salariale, minore è il livello occupazionale, teoricamente mi aspetto un salario più basso, che è in linea anche con la curva di Phillips, invece qui avviene esattamente il contrario. Più è basso il livello occupazionale e più è alto il salario. E quindi anche poi tutte le policy a livello monetario che ne dovrebbero conseguire verrebbero ribaltate, a mio avviso.
Okay, Fabrizio expressed his skepticism about the determination of wages, of the wage share in this model. I mean, the determination that can be derived from this picture. In his view, it makes no sense in a non-neoclassical world to have that when employment diminishes, you have a higher wage share or a higher wage. Okay. Well, I tend to agree with you 100%, but let me qualify my answer. My impression is that this does not follow strictly from his approach, because at the end of the day, it makes sense to me that you try to represent different actions of the two classes more or less in this way. And it makes more or less sense to me that outside the equilibrium, the real wage that matters is the real wage implied by the prices decided by oligopolistic firms. Then the trouble is that if you match what I've just said with the implicit assumption of decreasing marginal productivity of labor, you end up with the fact that when employment is lower, capitalists by themselves decide that for their own interest, it's better to have higher wage. And this is obviously not plausible, and I agree with you 100%, because the message here is that capitalists by themselves, when employment is lower, understand that it's more profitable from them to offer a higher wage. outside the neoclassical world, it's really hard to justify that, and I think we all agree on that. Yes. So I agree with you, but this has not strictly to do with this kind of bargaining framework. It has more to do with the tiny details. But yes, I think you are right. We have perhaps an.
So, in a sense, it is a kind of story similar to what find in Keynes. Because they are assuming a negative shocks on demand that will lower the rate of employment. And for this reason, because they are assuming in any case, also within an oligopolistic framework, that there are decreasing returns, you will have a higher real wage. So it's also in Keynes, if you have an increasing supply curve, when you have an increase in the rate of employment, you have a decrease in the real wages. So the causal nexus is different that in the marginalist theory, in the neoclassical theory. In the neoclassical theory, if because you have an higher real wage that you have a lower rate of employment, and so you have unemployment that depends from the fact that you have some kinds of rigidity in the labor market. In this case, I think that they are thinking more in line with Keynes. They are thinking that the rate of wages is in any case the result of the rate of employment. And so if you have decreasing returns, if the rate of employment is higher, you have a lower real wages. If is lower, you have a higher real wages.
I think we have another question from our audience, if you want, or Rafael.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Santiago.
There is a very nice paper written by that is called Classical-Keynesian aspect of Ukrainian world, but unfortunately.
So you can translate us it. Please do that.
Then related to the open economy, quite interesting because I think the machinery theory of value distribution will have the natural rate of interest and the natural rate of unemployment, the natural rate of capacity utilization, and the natural rate of change. I think it's quite mechanical relationship. And this mechanical relationship may be because of the Marshall-Lerner condition. But if this doesn't happen, then I think the Classical-Keynesian approach, the open economy, you can say a lot of things and see things according to different institutional runs. Because, for example, if you raise the real rate of interest, you can have a lower real exchange rate, and at the same time, higher real wage.
Lower in the sense in acquisitions.
Yes. You can have a real wage with a real rate of interest at the same time.
Okay, this was more of a comment. Well, at first he suggested us a paper which in English should sound something like Keynesian aspects of new Keynesians models, a paper written in Spanish by Boskin and one other guy that I don't remember. And then he made a comment about the open economy issues and a comment related to Professoressa Palumbo insight. And basically, Santiago stated that, well, in the neoclassical world, at the end of the day, the mechanism is quite simple. You have a natural rate of growth, a natural rate of interest, a natural rate of exchange that follows basically from the Marshall-Lerner imposition of the Marshall-Lerner rule. While if you move to a classical Keynesian approach, you have much more nuances that you can discuss. Like, for example, when you have an appreciation, you can have, in principle, both an increase in the real wage and
yes, of course. It's we have what happened? In order to try to understand something, we have simplified the analysis. For example, we have assumed that there is no change in labor productivity, and also, in a sense, an analysis that refers to a closed economy. What you are saying is true. Both an increase, for example, so in general, technical progress, an increase in labor productivity will reduce the conflict between, can, in a sense, reduce the conflict between workers and capitalists. In a sense, can more easily adjust the conflict because you have increase in labor productivity. And the same things is you have an appreciation of the exchange rate. If you have a lowering of the price of imports, also this fact can, in a sense, leave a greater income to be shared between wages and profits inside the economy. So these are all things that are very, very important when you analyze the course of income distribution with respect to a specific historical situations. I agree with you that you must account of these things in these respects. But when trying, in a sense, to specify some essential mechanism, we have decided to put aside these things because it's already complicated in this way. And if you put inside the scenario also the exchange rate, the possible effect of the change in the exchange rate on the real wages and so on, I think that the things become too complicated, at least for our minds. You know? I don't know if for others.
Rafael, we can take your question, I think. We don't have much time left because our faculty is going to close in 20.
No, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. You can close the meeting if you want.
No, but we have time for your question, absolutely.
Well, okay. So I'm gonna pose just, my last question. What do you think about? Because first I asked about the dimension of an open economy. Now I would like to ask you about the importance of including as well in the analysis the dimension of the fiscal authority, in a sense that once you change the exchange the interest rates, you're also affecting the interest payments that the government has to pay in the government bonds, right? At least in a. Say it again.
Yes.
We have lost you for a while, so we.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll repeat the question then.
Thank you.
I'm asking about the dimension of or the importance of including the dimension of the fiscal authority, in a sense that at least in developing countries, once you increase the interest rates, you also increase sharply the interest payments that the government has to pay for its debts, even if all its debts issued in domestic currency. You also increase by increasing interest rates, you also increase the interest payments, right? And the stock of debt as a proportion of GDP. And this has some unwanted effects on foreign investors, for instance, and they when they see that the debt as a proportion of GDP is increasing, they tend to withdraw capital from the country, and there's a huge capital outflows, and then you have an unwanted effect on an adverse effect of a more restrictive, of a more, say, contractionary contractionary monetary policy tends to increase that, which increase capital outflow, and it also raises the nominal exchange rate, and this affects positively prices, which means that once you increase, once you include the government authority or the fiscal authority in the model, you can actually have adverse effects of the monetary policy in the sense that, I'll repeat the mechanism. You increase interest rates, you increase the debt output ratio, which then leads to capital outflows, which leads to currency devaluation, and then increase prices, right? Which is a totally different effect that we have from the standard Taylor rule, in which you have an inverse relationship between prices and interest rates. But now, once you include the debt capital ratio and also the fiscal authority and the fiscal policy in the model, you can have alternative and unwanted effects of interest rates or monetary policy. So I'd like to, it's just a comment actually, and I'd like to know your intention for future work to include the fiscal authority and fiscal policy in the model, and the interaction between fiscal and monetary policy as well, and not placing all the burden on the distributional effects, right? What I'm calling attention here is because all the analysis you actually exposing here are basically aimed at the interaction or the bargaining power of workers and how the monetary policy affects the distributional effects and hence the conflict inflation. But I'm trying to call the attention to external effects not included in the model, such as open economy effects that drives cost push inflation, and also now the fiscal authority and the interaction between monetary fiscal policy. That's a comment / question, sorry.
The question is very long, Rafael. So just a very short answer. Yes, of course, the fiscal policy is very relevant. In a sense, I think that when you have restrictive monetary policies, you usually have also fiscal restrictive policies. In the sense that they go together. If they want to put under control price inflation. The problem of the interest on public debt is, of course, one of the points that central banks historically take into consideration when setting the rate of interest. So the minimization of the service of public debt can be one of the circumstances that influence the monetary policies. And perhaps this is different in different historical contexts. For example, after the Second World War, this was one of the main points driving the monetary policy. I also agreed with you that you can have yes. So I agree with you that when you have you consider an open economy, you can have effects completely different from that considering in the Taylor rule. So that you can have a rise in the rate of interest, and that will lead to a rise in price inflation, and not the contrary. But I am not so sure to what you said about the problem of public debt and the influence of the share of debt on GDP on the decision of investment in a country, in the sense that I think that the real problem is in this respect the external debt of the country, not so much the public debt of the country. This is the element that can drive a debt crisis. And in this way to have effects of on the exchange rates and on the interest rates. At least if you have now I don't remember in English, the sovereignty on money. So if you have a central bank and you can control money and the rate of interest. For Italy, for example, perhaps the things are in a sense different. But now. But if you can do this, I think that the very important point is the external debt, not the public debt. Anyway, but again, these are further points that, yes, are very interesting to be analyzed and to be deepened, but in a sense, after some initial and first works on this point. I mean that if you are interested on these issues, you can have a contact here at Roma 3 with Professor Ciccone, that I mean is have analyzed these issues on public debt more than us. Yes. Okay. I have answered to your question, yes. I hope. Okay.
Yes, perfect. Yeah. Thank you very much. So we're going to close the meeting now?
Yes, okay.
Okay, so... Yeah, just want to say thank you very much, Professor Sergio and Professor Ricardo. It was a great talk. It was very enlightening. I think everybody enjoyed very much. I did as well, at least.
Thank you. Thank you, Rafael.
Yeah, and looking forward to having you guys as well again in a future meeting and future events, right?
Okay, okay. Ciao, Rafael.
Ciao.
Thank you. Thank you.